All right, so this lesson may seem a little shorter than you think it should be, mostly because we've already gone over eutrophication in a previous lesson. But this is kind of a more detailed look. So, what causes eutrophication? Well, a lot of nutrients get into a body of water. This can be nitrogen, this can be potassium, this can be phosphorus. Those are kind of some of the main nutrients that will tend to cause eutrophication. So there are, of course, natural sources, but we're focused on anthropogenic sources. Anthropogenic, again, means caused by humans. So, what can happen is whenever you have a lot of fertilizer on a lawn or on a field of crops, any that is not absorbed by the plants tends to run off whenever it gets rained on. So, that water will carry away excess fertilizer, excess nutrients, and then that will end up in the nearest body of water. There's also if you release wastewater into the environment without treating it. So if you don't have a wastewater treatment plant and you just let um, water from a sewage system or a septic tank leak into the environment, that can cause eutrophication as well. So, here are the major steps of eutrophication, and there's going to be a diagram on the next page to look at. So, you have increased nutrients in a body of water cause what's called an algal bloom. So there are a couple of limiting factors in aquatic ecosystems. There's light, dissolved oxygen, and nutrients. If you are missing any of those three, you're not going to be able to have a functioning ecosystem because you're not going to be able to support producers. And without producers, there is no food chain. All right. So, what ends up happening is near, where a lot of times an ocean, a river feeds into an ocean or something like that. You have an influx of nutrients, and that allows producers to increase their population like crazy. And when these are algae, that causes what's called an algal bloom. The algal bloom can also be harmful depending on whether or not the algae produce any toxins. This can also be cyanobacteria, which are bacteria that photosynthesize. But once again, if they produce something toxic, that can be a problem for the local organisms. Another thing, if they start carpeting the surface of the body of water, that can starve out any photosynthesizers that are deeper in the underwater, and that can affect the food chain as well. And then once the algae use up the nutrients, they tend to die because they no longer have that limiting factor of nutrients. So then decomposing bacteria, other microbes, any decomposers in the area digest those dead algae. And that uses up dissolved oxygen. So that then takes out another limiting factor for life in aquatic ecosystems. But the problem is, even if you are an aquatic organism, most, if not all, animals breathe oxygen. There are a few exceptions that we really don't need to pay attention to. But most animals breathe oxygen. If you do not have oxygen, for example, in the water, then animals die. This condition where you don't have oxygen is called hypoxia. And that is what is caused by a algal bloom that decomposes and by eutrophication. So that leads to hypoxic conditions. And that hypoxia kills like all the animal life in the area, or it can kill a lot of the animal life in the area. And that creates what's called a dead zone. So let's look at this in diagram form. So here I have just some body of water. You have a pipe coming in from the left, which is releasing some nutrients into the water. We have some nice, happy little fish. We've got a certain level of dissolved oxygen there. Well, when the nutrients end up coming into the water, that allows algae populations to grow. And they grow and they grow and they grow until you have an algal bloom. Well, once the algae use up the nutrients, they start dying off. And those purple things are bacteria that are decomposing them. Now, decomposition, unfortunately, uses up oxygen. So the dissolved oxygen starts decreasing in that body of water. And then once it gets low enough, you end up having all of the local wildlife, the local animals die off, and that is going to create what's called a dead zone. So we have a term for an area that has very little dissolved oxygen. This is a hypoxic waterway. That literally means little or no dissolved oxygen in the water. Um, that means that animals cannot live there, so organisms that cannot escape or tolerate the hypoxia die. If organisms are able to escape the hypoxic areas, then they'll move out of the way. But if you have an organism that's not mobile or can't move fast enough, then it would die in that area. This can, of course, cause huge impacts on the ecosystem. You'll end up having the food chain disturbed. That affects industries in that area if there's fishing industry there. So that can be a really big problem. Then you have the opposite of that, which is called an oligotrophic waterway. So you can have a eutrophic body of water. It's going to tend to have a lot of plant growth. So lots of plants or algae. It's going to tend to have high nutrients. And it's going to have low dissolved oxygen. It's getting used up by all those organisms. On the other hand, an oligotrophic lake is going to have less plant matter, so less algae and plants. It's going to have lower levels of nutrients, and it tends to have higher dissolved oxygen. So the thing is, it's got higher dissolved oxygen, but since it has low nutrients, you're not really going to be able to support a lot of plant life there, which means organisms aren't going to have a producer to feed off of. A eutrophic lake, on the other hand, will have a lot of nutrients, but since there are a lot of organisms, plants, algae, etc., living there, and they die and then they get decomposed, and that uses up dissolved oxygen, eutrophic lakes, in general, unless it's an ecosystem that's adapted to that over a long period of time, if we've changed something to a eutrophic lake, then that's going to cause a lot of loss of life, loss of animal life there. So kind of depends on what you want the lake to be there for. If you want to be able to catch fish in it, etc., maybe an oligotrophic lake, or there's actually a type of lake in between oligotrophic and eutrophic that we're just not going to talk about. So keep these things in mind that I've written in red. And that is it. That is me drowning in an algal bloom. So hopefully that will help you guys remember this.